The day I found out what Ray was doing, I was supposed to be in Columbus. That was the thing. He knew my schedule. He'd made it his business to know my schedule. He checked it the same way some people check the weather, automatically, almost compulsively, because a man like Ray Holloway only moves when he believes the room is empty. But the meeting got canceled. At 7:14 in the morning, the client called and said they needed to push things back a week. I remember the exact time because I remember sitting in my car in the garage, looking at my phone, feeling that strange mixture of relief and inconvenience that comes with an unexpectedly free day. I didn't tell anyone. I just went inside. And that's when I heard it. The soft, deliberate click of a camera phone. Not a loud sound, not a careless sound. A careful or practiced sound, the sound of someone who had done this before. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase, and through the half-open door of my home office, I could see him, Ray, my brother-in-law, the man my sister loved, the man I had trusted with the finances of my father's company. He was standing at my desk, holding a stack of documents I recognized, and he was photographing them. One by one, methodically. And then he was forwarding them. To who, I didn't know yet. I stood there for 47 seconds. I counted, and I didn't stop him. People ask me, when I tell this story, why I didn't walk in there and confront him. Why I didn't say something. And I always give them the same answer, because I'd been watching him for 6 weeks. And I knew that one confrontation, one emotional, reactive confrontation, would ruin everything I'd already built against him. He was photographing the financial records of Cole Property Group, my company, my father's company. The thing my dad built with 30 years of cracked hands and 5 a.m. mornings and not a single dollar of inheritance. He was sending those documents to someone who I later discovered was planning to use them to push me out of my own business. And I stood there at the bottom of my staircase, heart rate barely elevated, and I watched him do it. That's the kind of woman I became, not the woman I started as. The woman I had to become to survive what came next. My name is Natalie Cole. I'm 41 years old. I run a company called Cole Property Group out of Dayton, Ohio, a commercial property management and landscaping firm that my father, Gerald Cole, built from absolute nothing starting in 1987. I want to be clear about what that means, because built from nothing is a phrase people throw around lightly, but in my father's case, it was literal. He came up from southeastern Kentucky with $200 and a truck he'd borrowed from his cousin. He got a contract mowing grass for a strip mall in Dayton. Then, 2 strip malls. Then, he started managing the properties themselves, collecting rent, handling maintenance calls, being the guy who showed up at 11 p.m. when the HVAC went down. He was reliable in a way that made people trust him with more properties, more contracts, more responsibility. By the time I was in high school, Cole Property Group managed 14 commercial properties. By the time I graduated college and came home to work beside him, it was 23. By the time my father died of a heart attack in 2017, sitting right there at his kitchen table with his coffee still hot beside him, we had 31 properties, generating around $4 million annually in management fees and rental income. He left it to me, 51%. He left Claire 49%. That was his balance. He loved us both equally, but he knew that someone needed to have operational control. He knew that someone needed the final say. He chose me because I had worked in the business for 12 years and Claire had not. That was the simple logic of it. No malice, no favoritism, just the quiet, practical wisdom of a man who had built something real and wanted it to survive. What my father didn't plan for, because you can't plan for everything. was Ray Holloway. I want to mention something here that I think matters, because it shapes the entire story in ways that only became clear to me later. My father left the company to me, his eldest daughter, in an industry that still, in 2017, in Dayton, Ohio, had more men at the head of conference tables than women. I had spent 12 years in commercial property management, earning the respect of contractors, tenants, and property attorneys, one transaction at a time. I had learned early that I needed to be twice as prepared as the man across the table to get half the credit. That reality never made me bitter. It made me thorough. And that thoroughness, the habit of documentation, the instinct to understand every structure from the inside out, is what ultimately saved everything. I don't think it's a coincidence that Ray chose me as a target. I also don't think it's a coincidence that he underestimated me. Let me tell you about what Cole Property Group meant to me. Not the revenue, not the properties. What it meant. When I was 7 years old, my father took me to a property we managed on a Saturday morning. A small office building, maybe 8,000 square feet. Nothing impressive, but he walked me through every room. He showed me the boiler room, the electrical panel, the roof access, the drainage slope in the parking lot. And he said to me, I remember this as clearly as I remember my own name. He said, Natalie, when you understand how something works, you can protect it. You can't protect what you don't understand. I never forgot that. I built my entire professional life around that single sentence. That company was also my daughter's future. Emma. She was 9 years old when Ray entered our lives, and 15 when all of this came to a head. She'd grown up coming to the office with me on Saturdays, the same way I had with my father. She knew the names of our property managers. She understood basic lease structures before she understood algebra. She was going to inherit something real, something built, something that had already survived 2 recessions and a pandemic. That was the plan. And that's what was at stake. Not just money. Emma's inheritance. My father's legacy. 30 years of 5 a.m. mornings that I was not going to let disappear quietly while Ray Holloway forwarded documents to a lawyer. Ray came into our lives in 2019. He met Claire at a conference in Chicago. She was there for a marketing seminar, and he was there presenting some kind of financial restructuring workshop. He was 44, fit, well-dressed. He had the specific kind of confidence that looks like competence until you've been around it long enough to see the seams. I want to be fair here. When I first met Ray, I liked him, and I'm not saying that to make myself look naive. I say it because it's true, and because it matters to understand what kind of person he was. He was warm. He asked good questions. He listened when you talked, not in the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but genuinely, carefully. He remembered details. 3 weeks after meeting him at dinner, he asked me how a specific property negotiation had gone. Not a deal I'd mentioned at length, but one I'd mentioned while ordering appetizers. Casually, briefly, he'd retained it. That's either attentiveness or calculation. I thought it was the former. He and Claire got married in October of 2020. Small ceremony, COVID protocols were still making everything complicated. I gave a toast about how he was the kind of man who paid attention, and I meant it as a compliment. The first sign that something was off didn't come until about 8 months after the wedding. Ray was a financial consultant by trade. Independent practice, high net worth clients, solid reputation, at least on paper. And shortly after he married Claire, he started expressing a casual interest in the business. Not aggressive, not demanding, just present. He'd ask questions over dinner. He'd make suggestions at family gatherings. He framed himself as someone who wanted to understand the thing Claire had inherited a stake in. I thought it was normal. A man married to a part owner of a family business should probably understand that business. So when he suggested one evening that he take a look at our financial structure, just a casual review, he said, over coffee, I said yes. That was 2021, and it was the first real mistake I made. Looking back, I understand exactly what he was doing. He had identified me as a woman who ran a sizable company without a formal financial partner. My divorce from Emma's father had been finalized 2 years earlier, and I was managing everything independently. He had correctly assessed that I was operationally strong, but that I relied on outside expertise for the financial architecture of the business, and he positioned himself inside that gap with the precision of someone who had studied exactly where to stand. I want to explain something. I'm not a financial person. I'm an operational person. I understand properties, contracts, relationships with tenants, maintenance schedules, long-term capital planning. Those things I do fluently. But balance sheets, tax structures, entity reorganization, I relied on our accountant, Linda Marsh, for all of that. And when Ray started inserting himself into that space, I was too trusting to see the displacement happening in real time. He started with small things. He suggested we restructure one of our holding LLCs for tax efficiency. He introduced us to a new accountant, someone he knew personally, a man named Dale Pittman. He framed it as upgrading our financial infrastructure. Linda was getting older anyway, he said. She was good, but she used old methods. Dale was sharper. There was also something else he did, subtly and consistently, that I only named much later. Whenever we were in a meeting together, with a contractor, a tenant, an attorney, Ray had a habit of slightly redirecting questions that were addressed to me. Not obviously, not rudely, but just enough. A gentle verbal intercept, what Natalie means is, a hand slightly raised before I could respond, and because he was charming and because his contributions were usually accurate, people mostly didn't notice. But I noticed. I just didn't understand yet what it was building toward. I signed off on the accountant change. I shouldn't have, but I did. For about 6 months, nothing visibly wrong happened. The books looked fine. The revenue was where it should be. I had no reason to be alarmed. The second sign was smaller and easier to miss. Ray started attending meetings he hadn't been invited to. Not confrontationally. He'd just show up with Claire, and because Claire was a 49% owner, no one questioned her presence, which meant no one questioned his. He was always quiet in these meetings, observant. He'd smile and nod and occasionally make an insightful comment about cash flow or depreciation schedules. He was making himself indispensable in the background, slowly and carefully, the way mold grows behind a wall. The third sign was one I almost didn't catch at all. In early 2022, our property manager for the Beaumont Street complex, a man named Todd, who'd worked for us for 11 years, came to me privately. He was uncomfortable. He said Ray had approached him directly with questions about lease renewal terms and had asked him not to mention it. Todd was loyal enough to mention it, but he was also nervous enough that he asked me, please, not to make a scene. I thanked Todd. I told him I appreciated it, and I sat on it. Because here's what was happening inside my head. I was doubting myself. Ray was my brother-in-law. He was married to my sister. He was, by all outward appearances, a successful professional with good intentions. And the alternative, that he was deliberately maneuvering inside my company, seemed almost too dramatic, too conspiratorial, the kind of thing you see in movies, not in a property management company in Dayton, Ohio. I also did something that I am less proud of, and that I think is worth naming, honestly. I told myself that maybe I was being paranoid, because I was a woman who had spent a long time guarding her professional authority against small erosions. That maybe the pattern I was seeing was something I was projecting because of my own history. That maybe I was making Ray into a threat because I was too accustomed to looking for threats. That self-doubt, the specific, gendered version of it that tells a woman her instincts are probably just anxiety, nearly cost me everything. I looked at the evidence and told myself it was nothing. I told myself Ray was just enthusiastic, just interested, just trying to be part of the family. I was wrong. I didn't know how wrong until the summer of 2022. That's when everything changed. What changed in the summer of 2022 started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. And I was in the back of the building that houses our main office, a converted Victorian we own outright on Linden Avenue. I was checking a water intrusion issue near the foundation, crouched behind the building with a flashlight. Ray didn't know I was there. He was standing on the small side porch, maybe 20 feet from me, on his phone. The window beside me was open. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I heard my name, and I stopped moving. "Natalie won't see it coming," he said. And then a pause. And then. The structure is actually perfect for what we need. The 49% has real leverage if we document her decision-making failures correctly. I don't remember the drive home that evening. I remember arriving in my kitchen and standing at the sink and running the water cold and just holding my wrists under it. While my heart was not calm in that moment, my mind was not strategic. I was hurt. Deeply, viscerally hurt in the way you can only be hurt by someone you trusted. But I had learned something from my father and from years of managing properties where the difference between a good outcome and a disaster was whether you acted impulsively or methodically. I stood at that sink for 10 minutes. And then I made a decision. I was not going to say a word to anyone. Not yet. I was going to prepare. The first call I made was to a woman named Patricia Owens. She's an attorney who specializes in business law, and I'd used her twice before for contract disputes. I met with her in person, privately, and I told her everything. The casual insertions, the accountant replacement, Todd's report, the phone call. Well, Patricia was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said something that changed the entire shape of my response. She said, "Natalie, if what you're describing is accurate, what Ray is building toward is a petition to have you removed as operating partner on grounds of mismanagement. If he and Claire jointly, as 49% owners, can document enough instances of poor decision-making or financial irregularity, and if he controls the financial records through his own accountant, he can build a paper case against you." She let that land for a second. "The company doesn't get stolen in one dramatic moment," she said. "It gets stolen in 2 years of small paperwork, and by the time you realize it, the narrative is already written." That was the moment I understood the full shape of what I was facing. And that was the moment I decided to start building my own response. Patricia also said something else, something I've replayed many times since. She said, "I want you to be aware of one additional dynamic here. If Ray is sophisticated enough to do what you're describing, he's almost certainly counting on the assumption that you'll respond emotionally when this becomes visible. He'll expect a confrontation, a breakdown of family relations, a public dispute that he can characterize as instability on your part. Your most powerful weapon is not giving him that." I understood her immediately, and I agreed. Not because I was incapable of emotion, I was full of it, but because I knew how to set it aside when there was work to be done. My father had taught me that too, though not in words. In example. Over the next 2 weeks, now working quietly and separately from anything Ray had access to, Patricia and I restructured my ownership through an irrevocable trust. The Cole Family Legacy Trust. 51% of Cole Property Group, tied to an administrative structure that required my signature, and only my signature, for any fundamental change. We also added a clause that any challenge to my operating authority required independent third-party arbitration, not just a partnership vote. In parallel, Patricia connected me with a forensic accountant named James Keller. I gave James access to every financial record we had, the originals, which I had kept personally, not the versions Dale Pittman was managing. What James found over the following 3 weeks was not immediately catastrophic, but it was meaningful. expense reclassifications, small revenue deferrals. Line items that had been reattributed in ways that, individually, looked like accounting preferences, but collectively formed a pattern designed to make the company's performance look worse under my management than it actually was. Someone was building a case file. Building it slowly, carefully, with just enough plausible deniability that no single entry looked criminal. But the pattern was clear. "This is sophisticated," James told me. "Whoever is doing this understands exactly how to stay below the threshold of obvious fraud while still constructing a misleading picture." I didn't know how far he'd go yet. That was the honest truth. I had the shape of the plan, but not its destination. I didn't know if Ray was building toward a partnership squeeze-out, a hostile restructuring, or something more aggressive. I needed him to show me. Fully, on the record. So I made my second major decision of that period. I installed a security system in my home office, cameras in 2 corners, a motion-activated recording device in the filing cabinet that I had positioned to look like a simple power strip. All of it recording to a cloud server that only I had access to. And then I waited. That's when I decided to prepare for something worse, because everything I was seeing told me this wasn't close to finished. I want to be honest, the next 4 months were the hardest of my life, not because the plan was failing, but because I was watching my sister every single day and wondering how much she knew. Claire is 2 years younger than me. We were close as children in a way that a lot of siblings are but don't sustain. We actually sustained it. After our father died, we grieved together in a way that brought us even closer. She was at my house for dinner at least twice a week. She and Emma had a relationship that was the closest thing Emma had to an aunt who felt more like a second mother. Warm, consistent, present. Watching Ray move through our family while sitting across from Claire at dinner, watching her laugh at something he said, watching her look at him with the uncomplicated love that comes from not knowing. That was the hardest part of the entire experience. I needed to protect her too, but I couldn't tell her yet, because there was a real possibility, one I wrestled with at 3 a.m. more times than I can count, that Claire was involved. Not maliciously, but involved. That Ray had shared enough of his plan that she'd agreed, or been persuaded, or simply hadn't asked the right questions. And so I had to hold both possibilities in my mind simultaneously, that my sister was innocent, and that she might not be. In October 2022, the plan almost collapsed. My daughter, Emma, 15, perceptive in the way that teenagers raised around business become perceptive, noticed that I seemed different, distant, watchful. She came to me one evening while I was reviewing documents at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, what's wrong with Uncle Ray?" I went very still. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He asked me last week if you and Dad ever fought about money before the divorce. And he asked me about your phone, like whether you use the same phone for work and personal stuff." I kept my face neutral. I told her Ray was just curious and that it was nothing to worry about. She looked at me with her grandfather's eyes, my father's eyes, the same serious, measured look, and said, "Okay, but I'm not telling him anything." That was my daughter. 15 years old and already more discerning than I'd given her credit for, but that conversation scared me deeply. If Ray was trying to gather information through Emma, then either he was becoming impatient or he suspected I'd noticed something. Either way, the timeline had just compressed. I called Patricia that night. She told me we needed to accelerate. Then, in November 2022, the second complication hit. James Keller, my forensic accountant, discovered something that changed the scope of the problem entirely. He found a document, a draft document, never filed but existent, In a shared financial folder that Dale Pittman had accidentally left accessible, it was a draft petition for involuntary dissolution of partnership, and signed by both Claire and Ray. Claire's signature. I sat in James's office and looked at that signature for a long time. And I felt something I don't have a clean word for. It was grief and anger and disorientation all at once. The specific pain of seeing someone you love's handwriting on a document designed to take something from you. My sister, my father's other daughter, her name on the paperwork that was supposed to end what he built. I still don't know, to this day, whether Claire knew what she was signing. Ray could have presented it as something routine, something procedural. He was capable of that. She trusted him the way people trust their spouses. Completely, without the fine print scrutiny. But the signature was real. And it complicated everything. I had to make a choice. Confront Claire now, or wait until I had the full picture. Patricia advised me to wait. James advised me to wait. Every rational instinct I had advised me to wait. But God, it was hard. December came. Christmas dinner at Claire and Ray's house. Ray was in top form. Charming, generous, full of warmth. He gave Emma a beautiful leather journal. He gave me a bottle of wine I'd mentioned months earlier, liking at a restaurant. He toasted my father, said everything a good man would say, and looked me in the eyes with a steadiness that was either innocence or extraordinary nerve. At one point during dinner, he turned to the table and said, with a smile, "I now understand differently. Natalie is one of the most impressive people I've ever met. Gerald raised a woman who could run any company in this city." He raised his glass toward me. Everyone at the table smiled. Claire beamed. I raised my glass back. I smiled exactly the right amount, because I wasn't ready yet, and I needed him to take the final step himself. January 2023. I had been watching the patterns closely enough to know that Ray's rhythm was predictable. Every time I traveled for work, he moved. Not dramatically, not yet, but he would make calls, visit the office after hours, access files. I had the recordings. I had the forensic accounting analysis, but what I needed was something undeniable, something documented in real time, something that even the most generous interpretation couldn't explain away as innocent curiosity. Patricia had been specific about what she needed. "What you have right now," she told me in early January, "is compelling, but it's not airtight. The accountant stuff has plausible deniability. The overheard conversation is inadmissible and unprovable. What I need is Ray accessing privileged documents without authorization. Specifically, the trust documents, the ownership structure, or the operating agreement, because those are the exact documents he'd need to challenge your control. If I can show he obtained those covertly, we have the foundation for a criminal filing alongside the civil action." So I set it up. I booked a trip to Columbus. Client meeting, February 3rd. I made sure Ray knew about it. I mentioned it at a family dinner, gave the time I was leaving, said I'd be home by evening. I made it sound like a completely ordinary day. A woman with a full schedule and a predictable calendar. Exactly what he expected me to be. Then I canceled the meeting quietly, early in the morning before anyone was awake. I parked 3 streets over and walked back to my house through the alley behind the property. I came in through the back door, the one that opens into the laundry room, the one that doesn't chime on the security system, because I had disabled that specific sensor 2 weeks earlier without telling anyone. I sat on the stairs. And I waited. At 9:41 in the morning, I heard Ray's car in the driveway. This is the part of the story I want to slow down for you, because I've thought about it so many times since that I can recall it in complete detail, almost like footage. I heard him use his key. Claire's key, the one she'd had copied for him years earlier. I heard the specific sound of the front door, the way the weather stripping catches slightly before releasing. I heard his footsteps in the entry hall, measured, unhurried. Now the walk of a man who believes he's alone. He went to the kitchen first. I heard the refrigerator open and close. He got a glass of water. Normal, settling in, making himself at home in my home in the practiced, unself-conscious way of someone who had been here alone before. I thought, sitting there on the stairs with my back against the wall. He has done this before. This specific walk through someone else's house. This specific comfort in an empty room that wasn't his. Then I heard him come down the hall toward the office. I was at the top of the stairs. The office is off the main hallway, directly below where I was sitting. I could see the top of his head through the banister. He paused at the office door for a moment, checking, I think, listening, and then he went inside. I heard the desk chair roll back, tried the creak of it under his weight. Then silence for about 2 minutes. He was on his laptop. Then I heard the sound of the filing cabinet, the second drawer, which is where I keep the legal documents, including the operating agreement and, importantly, a folder I had labeled very deliberately as Trust Restructure, Do Not Copy. I had told no one that folder existed. I had placed it there 6 weeks earlier, specifically for this moment. The drawer opened. I heard the sound of documents being moved, pages, then the soft, unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking, once, twice, 7 times. Then I heard him typing, sending something. I had the camera footage running in real time on my phone, streamed from the 2 office cameras. I watched the screen with the quiet, all-focused attention of a woman who has been waiting 6 months for this exact moment. Ray was standing at the filing cabinet, documents in hand, photographing them with his personal phone. He then went to the desk, opened my laptop, the one I had intentionally left accessible with a simple, obvious password, and logged into what he thought was our shared company drive. It was actually a mirrored copy I had set up with James's help. A read-only version that logged every access with timestamps and IP addresses. He spent 11 minutes in that office. He accessed 4 document folders. He photographed at least 30 pages of material. He was thorough. He was professional. He was completely composed. And then he put everything back, carefully, precisely the way a meticulous man puts things back, and he left. I didn't move until I heard his car leave the street. Then I sat on the stairs for about 5 minutes. And I wasn't triumphant. That's the honest thing I'll tell you. I felt something closer to a deep, exhausted sadness. Because watching Ray move through that office, through my father's things, photographing the work of 3 decades with the focused efficiency of a man executing a plan, it was both proof of everything I feared and confirmation of everything I'd already grieved. The trust, the family, the belief that the people around you are who they present themselves to be. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. Something that had been building quietly for 6 months. A steady, unshakable certainty. I had him. I called Patricia from the kitchen before I even made coffee. She answered on the second ring, and I said, and simply, he did it. She said, tell me everything. I walked her through it in complete detail. The timestamp, the documents he'd accessed, the mirrored drive log, the camera footage. She was quiet as I talked, and when I finished, she said in a tone that was calm but carried a particular weight. Natalie, I want you to send me that footage. Don't share it with anyone else. And I need you to not contact Ray, not contact Claire, and not change anything in that office. Can you do that? I said yes. Good, she said, because what he just handed us is more than enough. I didn't know exactly what she meant by that last part yet. I was about to find out. What I had believed was happening. A corporate squeeze-out. A petition for mismanagement. Turned out to be only the surface of what Ray had actually planned. Now, Patricia had been working with a private investigator named Carver since November, cross-referencing Ray's financial consulting clients against the Cole Property Group assets. What they found, in the weeks between January's surveillance and what came next, was this. Ray had a silent partner, a real estate investment group out of Cincinnati, a firm called Westgate Capital that had a standing interest in distressed or restructured commercial portfolios. The plan wasn't just to push me out. The plan was to force a dissolution of the partnership structure, acquire Claire's 49% under Ray's fiduciary control through a proxy entity he had set up, combine it with a legal challenge to my 51% through the mismanagement petition, and sell the entire portfolio to Westgate Capital. Not a piece of it, all of it. Every single property. 31 buildings, $4 million annually. My father's 30 years. Gone. And Ray would walk away with a finder's fee and a percentage of the acquisition. Westgate had already made a preliminary offer, contingent on restructuring. The deal had a projected close date of April 2023. When Patricia told me this, I remember precisely where I was sitting, and I remember that I said nothing for a very long time. And she let me have that silence, because she understood what it meant. They weren't just trying to push me out of my own company, they were trying to erase my father's company entirely, convert it into a line item on someone else's balance sheet, turn 3 decades of Gerald Cole's life into a transaction. That's when the sadness ended, and something much quieter and much more focused took its place. Patricia moved fast. By the end of January, she had assembled a complete package. The camera footage from February 3rd, the mirrored drive access logs, the forensic accounting analysis from James Keller, the draft dissolution petition bearing Claire's signature, the connection to Westgate Capital through Carver's investigation, and 3 additional pieces of evidence that I'll describe in a moment because they change the legal calculus significantly. The first additional piece. Patricia had subpoenaed Ray's communications through his business email, something she was able to do because Ray had, at one point, sent several emails through a Cole Property Group address that had been set up for him during the financial review. By doing so, he had implicitly communicated through company infrastructure, which gave us standing to access those communications in a civil proceeding. Among those emails were direct conversations with Dale Pittman instructing him to reclassify certain expenses. Not suggestions. Instructions. In writing. The second piece. Carver found that the proxy entity Ray had created, a shell LLC called Holloway Asset Management, had been registered in Delaware 8 months before he even married Claire, before he was ever involved with Cole Property Group. This wasn't opportunism. This had been planned, potentially from the beginning. The third piece was the one I think about the most. Even now. Carver pulled Ray's professional background more thoroughly than any of us had done at the outset. And he found a previous case in Georgia from 2015, all a family business in Savannah, a catering company where Ray had been a consultant. The business had been dissolved within 18 months of Ray's involvement. The family had sued, but settled quietly. Non-disclosure agreement. No public record beyond the original filing. And when Carver dug into what little was publicly available, he found that in that case, too, the majority owner had been a woman. A woman who had inherited the business from a parent and was running it independently. We weren't the first. When Patricia showed me that detail, I felt something shift inside my chest. A cold, clarifying anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that moment, because it confirmed what I had suspected but not wanted to fully believe, that Ray hadn't just seen an opportunity in a family business. He had specifically targeted a particular kind of situation, a woman, alone, running something her father built, and he had done it before, with enough success to refine his approach. On February 14th, 2023, Valentine's Day, which I mention only because of the bitter irony, Patricia filed a civil action against Raymond Holloway for breach of fiduciary duty, tortious interference with business relations, misappropriation of confidential business documents, conspiracy to defraud, and fraudulent concealment. The filing named Dale Pittman as co-respondent. It also formally notified Westgate Capital that any acquisition attempt connected to the current ownership dispute would be subject to immediate injunctive relief. That same morning, at Patricia's instruction, I called Claire. I'm not going to give you a dramatic version of that conversation. The truth is that it was quiet and it was terrible. I told her to come over. I told her I needed to show her something, and when she arrived, I sat across from her at my kitchen table. The same table where my father used to drink his coffee, and I laid everything out in front of her. The documents, the footage, the Georgia case, the Westgate Capital connection. All of it. Claire did not cry immediately. She went very still, in the way people go still when the world is reorganizing itself around them and they need a moment to catch up. She looked at the footage on my laptop. She read the emails. She looked at her own signature on the dissolution petition. Then she looked up at me and said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "He told me it was a tax restructuring form. He said you and he had already discussed it." I watched her face as she said it. And I believed her. I believe her to this day. Not because I needed to believe her, but because I know my sister, and what I saw in her face in that moment was not the shame of someone caught. It was the particular devastation of someone who has just understood, all at once, that the person they loved most was never entirely real. She started crying quietly, with the particular quality of someone who is ashamed and frightened and grieving all at once. I reached across the table and took her hand. The civil filing triggered an immediate response from Ray's attorney, which was expected. What was less expected was that within 48 hours of the filing, the Ohio Attorney General's office had been contacted by Patricia regarding potential criminal fraud. And within a week, Ray received a target letter. For those who don't know what a target letter is, it's formal notification from a government authority that you are the subject of a criminal investigation. It's not an indictment, but it's the step before an indictment. And it changes everything about the dynamics of a civil case, because suddenly, Ray's attorney was no longer focused on fighting the civil action. Suddenly, Ray had much larger problems. By mid-March, Ray and his attorneys reached out to Patricia for a settlement conversation. He settled. Fully. He signed over everything, a complete withdrawal from any claim to or involvement in Cole Property Group, a formal acknowledgement of the actions documented in the civil case, nor a full financial accounting that revealed the true extent of the expense manipulation, which turned out to be close to $280,000 in misrepresented costs over 18 months, and a structured restitution payment. Dale Pittman lost his accounting license in a separate proceeding. Westgate Capital's preliminary offer quietly disappeared. Their legal team, after reviewing the exposure risk of the Holloway connection, made the extremely sensible decision to never have any further contact with Cole Property Group. And Ray Holloway, the man who had walked into my family with a smile and a plan and years of practiced charm, a man who had looked at me and seen not a woman to reckon with, but a woman to outmaneuver, left Dayton with exactly what he'd arrived with. Nothing that was mine. And I want to stop here and be honest with you about something that gets glossed over in stories like this, because stories like this usually end with the win and then cut to black. They skip the part where the win doesn't actually feel like winning. The civil case closed in April 2023. By May, Ray had moved out of the house he and Claire shared. By June, Claire had filed for divorce, and none of that felt like victory to me. Not even close. Claire came to my house the day after Ray left. She sat in my kitchen for 3 hours. She didn't want to talk about Ray. She didn't want to process the legal case or the documents or the money. She wanted to talk about the fact that she had loved him, genuinely, completely, with the kind of trust that you extend to a partner. Banayan, she was asking herself, the way you do after something like this, how much of it had been real? Whether any of it had been real. Whether the man who remembered the names of her childhood friends and cried at their father's funeral and slow danced with her in the kitchen on a Tuesday night had been real, or whether he was just a performance so thorough that even he had half believed it. I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't. There's a particular cruelty in being deceived by someone who performed love well, because the love felt real, the warmth felt real, Christmas dinner felt real, and then you find out that underneath the warmth was a spreadsheet, and you have to go back through every memory and wonder which ones were genuine and which ones were theater. That process is brutal. It's more brutal, in some ways, than just being robbed. Because you can replace money. You can't unfeel things. And for Claire, it was layered with something additional and painful. The knowledge that she had unknowingly been used as a vehicle. That the man who had asked her to marry him had done so in part because of what her last name represented. That she had been an instrument. I watched my sister carry that weight for months. There's a particular wound in that specific realization, and it doesn't heal quickly. She'd call me late at night sometimes, and we'd just talk. Not about Ray, not about the case, just about things. Old memories, dad stories, Emma's school stuff. Finding our way back to the version of us that existed before all of this interrupted us. I want to tell you about Ray's mother, because this is the part of the story that makes it genuinely complicated in a way I wasn't expecting. Her name is Donna Holloway. She's in her mid-70s, a kind, soft-spoken woman who lives in Indiana. She called me in May, after the settlement, and she apologized. She apologized for her son. She told me she had known since his 30s that Ray had a pattern, that he had an orientation toward other people's success, toward finding it and attaching himself to it and eventually attempting to redirect it toward himself. She said she'd spent years trying to understand where that came from. She said she didn't have an excuse for him, only an explanation, and she wasn't sure the explanation helped anyone. I thanked her. I genuinely thanked her, because that call took real courage. And because it reminded me that the damage Ray did radiated outward in ways that weren't contained to my family. He was her son. She had to live with what he'd done too. She had her own grief about it, her own bewilderment, her own unanswerable questions. And she reached across all of that to apologize to a woman her son had tried to rob. That was the morally gray part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into a narrative of victory. Because behind the villain, there is almost always a person with a mother who raised them and doesn't understand where things went wrong and who doesn't deserve what their child's choices have cost her. I think about Donna sometimes, but the conversation that hit me deepest in the aftermath, the one that I returned to more than any legal victory or document filed, happened about 3 weeks after the settlement, when Emma came to me after school and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I'm glad it's over." Just that. Simply. I asked her if she understood what had happened. She said she understood most of it. She said she'd known something was wrong for a long time. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner about Ray asking questions. I told her she had nothing to be sorry about. She said, "Mom, can I tell you something?" I said yes. She said, "I looked up the trust structure, the Cole Family Legacy Trust. I was curious, so I looked it up, and I found my name." I looked at her for a long moment. Because yes, when Patricia and I had set up the trust in the fall of 2022, I had included Emma as a named beneficiary with a direct succession clause. The company would not dissolve in the event of my death or incapacity. It would pass to Emma, with a designated trustee to manage it until she turned 25. "Your grandfather is in that trust too," I told her. "His name is on the founding documents. That's how the trust was written, so that Cole Property Group always knows where it came from. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she said, "He would have been really proud of you." I had to look away at that point. I sat there at my father's kitchen table, the table where he drank his coffee, where he made his 5 a.m. plans, where he left his newspaper folded exactly the same way every morning. And I didn't say anything for a while. And Emma didn't push, because she understood without being told that some things need a moment of silence to be properly respected. My father raised 2 daughters. He left his life's work to the one who had spent 12 years learning how it operated from the inside out. He didn't leave it to her because she was the eldest, or because he loved her more. He left it to her because he trusted her to protect it. I hope I did, Dad. I think I did. It's been 2 years since the settlement. Cole Property Group currently manages 34 properties, 3 more than when all of this started, because we acquired 2 buildings in the immediate aftermath that had been quietly undervalued by the manipulated financial reports. James Keller's forensic work inadvertently created a detailed map of exactly which assets had been understated, and we used that map to correct the valuations and expand accordingly. Claire is doing well. She's living in a different part of Dayton now, in a house she chose herself, and she's gone back to school part-time, something she'd always wanted to do and had set aside during the marriage. She and Emma still have dinner every other week. The relationship between us is different than it was before Ray, but it's not less. If anything, it's more honest, more careful, more consciously chosen. I still walk properties on Saturday mornings. Emma comes with me less frequently now. She's 17 and has a life of her own, but sometimes she still does. And when she does, I still show her how things work. The drainage slopes, or the electrical panels, the things you have to understand to protect what you have. Patricia Owens reviewed and updated the trust documents earlier this year. Everything is current, protected, and clearly structured. The Cole Family Legacy Trust will outlast anything Ray was planning. That was always the point. And Ray? His criminal case did not ultimately result in an indictment. The civil settlement and the restitution payment complicated the prosecution's calculus, as these things sometimes do. He's not in prison. I'm not going to tell you that doesn't bother me, because it does. But I'm also not going to tell you that what happened to him was nothing. He lost his professional reputation in Ohio permanently. His consulting license was suspended pending the investigation and was never reinstated. He lost his marriage. He lost the access he had spent years carefully cultivating. He lost the deal that was supposed to be the culmination of everything he'd engineered. He started from scratch, in a different state, with a different professional name if you look him up, which I don't recommend because it's genuinely not worth your time. What I want to leave you with is not really a story about catching someone in the act, or about legal strategy, or about surveillance cameras and forensic accountants, even though all of those things were part of what happened. What I want to leave you with is something simpler and more durable. My father told me when I was 7 years old, when you understand how something works, you can protect it. You can't protect what you don't understand. I used to think that was advice about buildings, about boilers and drainage slopes and electrical panels. I don't think that anymore. It's advice about everything. It's advice about business structures and legal documents, yes, but it's also advice about relationships, about the people you let into your trust, your home, your family. About the systems, emotional and financial and structural, that hold your life together. And I'll say something that I think is especially true for women who run businesses, who inherit something, who are the ones responsible for protecting what someone else built. The world is full of people who will look at what you have and calculate quietly, whether you understand it well enough to hold on to it, whether you're strong enough, prepared enough, thorough enough. You have to be the answer to that question before they even finish asking it. An understanding is not cynicism. Understanding is not paranoia. You can love people fully and still understand how trust operates. You can extend warmth and generosity and still know that real protection requires real knowledge. You can be the woman who greets everyone at her table on a Saturday morning and also be the woman who knows exactly where the documentation lives and exactly what it says and exactly what it protects. I am not a suspicious person. I am an understanding person. And I've learned, at real cost, to see the difference. The day I stood at the bottom of my staircase and watched Ray photograph my father's documents, I was afraid beneath the stillness. Not afraid of Ray, exactly. Afraid of the possibility that I might not be enough. That the thing my father built might not be strong enough to survive what was coming. And that preparation might not beat calculation. But here's what I've learned, and I want you to hear this clearly. Preparation always beats calculation. Because calculation is reactive. It is always responding to a situation, looking for the angle, reading the room moment by moment. Preparation is structural. It's already done before the moment arrives. It doesn't need to think in the moment, because the thinking already happened months earlier in a quiet attorney's office. The trust was already filed, the cameras were already recording, the forensic accountant was already finished. By the time Ray picked up that stack of documents and pointed his phone at them, the outcome was already decided. He just didn't know it yet. He had looked at me, a woman running her late father's company, recently divorced, to managing everything alone. And he had seen a target, a gap in the defenses, a soft place to press. He was wrong about all of it, and that, the calm, methodical, unhurried work of protecting what matters to you before the threat announces itself. That is the thing I want you to carry away from this story. Not the drama, not the confrontation, not even the legal victory. The preparation, because the people who want what you've built will almost always be charming. They will almost always arrive through a door you opened yourself. They will almost always speak warmly about the people you love. They will almost always make you doubt your own instincts before the damage becomes visible. And they will count on you being too emotional, too trusting, too distracted, or too polite to stop them. The only real, lasting answer to that is to understand what you have so completely, so structurally, so thoroughly, that no one can rewrite it without your knowing. Build the trust. Know the documents. Understand the structures. Record the evidence before you think you need it. Know how the things you love actually work. And when someone you trusted decides to move against you in the quiet hours when they believe you're not watching, let them. Let them make every move they planned. Let them execute the strategy they spent years building. Let them believe, completely and comfortably, that they are winning. And then, let the work you already did speak for itself. My name is Natalie Cole. I'm 41 years old. I run the company my father built, and it's still here. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to protect something you love from someone you trusted, I want to hear from you in the comments. And if you want to see more stories like this, real situations, real decisions, real consequences, subscribe, because I have more to tell. This was Natalie's story. It won't be the last.